Two articles of mine were recently published that involved the new war in the Middle East. The second of these, published by Merion West, discusses the compatibility problems between Islam and the West. But this article is not YouTube safe, so to speak, and it is also very, very long. But for those who are interested in it, I link to that article in the description below. The first article, however, called What One Must Understand About the New Israel War, and which was also published by Merion West on November 11th, explains some of the philosophical and cultural ramifications of the war for the West, and it is mostly YouTube safe. So in this video, I will offer a shortened version of that article, but again, I link to the full text of that as well below. To be a philosopher, one must start from the beginning. It is not for naught that Hobbes introduces his exposition on the state by discussing such things as human perception, imagination, and reason, and that Hegel discusses scientific cognition before launching into his phenomenology. Such holistic treatments are not always practical, and most readers nowadays do not have the patience to concentrate for that long. But it is important to retain, as a philosopher, at least the spirit of foundational inquiry, so as to avoid the thought cliches within which even relatively intelligent people tend to become trapped. To few current issues does this apply as well as it does to the Middle East conflict, as has been seen over the last couple of months since the outbreak of the most recent war. This war has some important cultural and philosophical ramifications for the West, and probably in particular for Western Europe, but also for America. Some of the thought cliches common in the West, including among parts of the political right, must be questioned. Examples of these thought cliches are the peace process and the two-state solution, because ultimately, whoever speaks of these, or even more generally of a political settlement, has not understood the conflict at all. More general thought cliches that are implicated in the new war include the idea of the equality of cultures and peoples, as well as the narcissistic Western notion that other peoples desire the same things as we do. Once we are ready to discard these notions, or at the very least not to take them for granted, can we start the discussion at an earlier, more fundamental stage. And it is then that we realize that the new war in the Middle East is not an expression of a conflict between two regional statehood claims, or even, more fundamentally, simply a fight between Judaism and Islam, although it is also the latter. Rather, it is, even more fundamentally, a civilizational confrontation that pits two world systems against each other. In that sense, the new war belongs with such days as Marathon, Zama, Milvian Bridge, Tours, Waterloo, and Omaha Beach. Israel is the front line of the West. When we question the thought cliches, we realize that there will not be peace even in the long run, because by definition there can never be peace between barbarianism and civilization. Peace comes only when one side subjugates the other, as we see everywhere in history. We also realize ideas that Westerners today would call uncomfortable, if they managed to bring themselves to such ideas at all, that is. Namely, for instance, the notion that while Rome's wiping out of Carthage in 146 BC as a part of the Third Punic War certainly caused great suffering, it also prevented great suffering by ensuring almost unbroken peace in that part of the Mediterranean for the next half millennium. That temporary ruthlessness, being unfazed by pain and suffering, to follow a famous Italian Renaissance philosopher, can sometimes be the most humane course of action. That much of the world does not, in fact, share our beliefs about the highest good, and that not every human life has the same worth as every other human life. For example, the difference between a serial rapist and Beethoven is far greater than that between a serial rapist and a cockroach. These ideas should not be entertained in a slipshod manner, but only when we are willing to entertain them can we begin to understand the cultural dimension of the new war. That the West has forgotten these ideas, and by and large has not yet begun to recollect them, can be seen when even ostensibly right-wing European politicians stated after the initial Hamas attacks on October 7th that any use of financial aid for anti-Semitic purposes must be out of the question, not understanding that aid to the Palestinians is ipso facto aid for anti-Semitic purposes. When Western orcophobic intellectuals claim, in a fallacious argument to moderation, that both Hamas's attacks and Israel's counterattacks are wrong, and when they thereby try to display their nuanced thinking by criticizing Israel as much as her enemies, and finally, when Westerners believe that the present conflict can be solved through practical compromises rather than through overwhelming force, not understanding that power is the ultimate language in the Middle East and in many other parts of the world, and will one day be so in the West itself again. These ways of thinking are indicative of an old social thought paradigm that is ceasing to exist. As long as one thinks within this paradigm, even if one prefers Israel and wants a negotiated peace treaty that favors Israel, one is intellectually useless in this context, because such a thing will not come to pass, and it is an illusion. That is, a new thought paradigm is needed in order for the conflict to be understood, where a whole different set of questions is posed and answered. This was always the case, of course, but only now is there at least a possibility that more people will begin to understand it. The notion that we are all really the same, and that the rest of the world desire what we in the West desire, such as, for example, peace, freedom, life, and so on, goes back to the French so-called Enlightenment, which damaged as much as it helped the West's collective understanding of the world. Voltaire writes in his Notes on Pascal's Pensée that morality is the same everywhere. In the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in the Emperor Julian, in the slave Epictetus, and, as you yourself admire it, in Saint Louis, and in his conqueror Baibars, in the Chinese Emperor Qianlong, and in the King of Morocco. And Rousseau, in Book 4 of Émile, claims that among this prodigious variety of manners and customs, you will find everywhere the same ideas of justice and righteousness, everywhere the same principles of morality, everywhere the same notions of good and evil. The influence of these gentlemen's stark ignorance can be seen in vulgar statements on social media today that the Abrahamic religions all desire the same thing, essentially some version of love thy neighbor, but that they are distorted by small bands of extremists. Or one might hear that cultures committing acts of great gruesomeness and bigotry are actually fine, only that there are some individual extremists at the top of the culture who, as demagogues, whip up the people beneath them into performing atrocities they would not otherwise condone. This idea, of course, understands little of the underlying cruelty and tribalism of earlier stage human culture and of human beings more generally, and of the fact that in some cultures, millions upon millions of otherwise seemingly decent and even charming people think that, for example, all Jews and homosexuals should be rounded up and killed. To get a clearer sense of how incorrect these modern Western notions are, one would have to read the sacred texts and the philosophers of the various religions. And, of course, one would also have to see how those philosophies play themselves out in the real world. And on a side note, this is what that second article of mine that I mentioned in the beginning is more about in detail, but like I said, it's not YouTube safe, but so do check that out if you can. This Western naivete, in fact, represents a popular rump version of Christianity, and certainly not of Judaism, which has no notion of turning the other cheek. This watery or sugary form of Christianity stems in large part from Christianity's self-secularization through Enlightenment ideas in the 19th century, something that grew in strength in the 20th century, especially after World War II. It embraces, wittingly or not, the pacifism of the Sermon on the Mount, the peacemakers and the putatively poor in spirit, while disregarding the more sophisticated Christian philosophers who attempted to apply Jesus' teachings to the real world and who established concepts of just war and other practical matters. The abandonment of this contemporary Western naivete does not mean that one necessarily abandons the idea of jus in bello, laws of war, and that absolutely anything goes. But it does mean that one understands that as the nature of the war changes, so the nature of the law must change correspondingly. Some might protest that the whole point of law is that it remain fixed regardless of changing circumstances. But this protest prefers words to life, and it comes from a vain and philosophically realist love of one's own ideas. The clash of the British and the French armies and their allies at Blenheim, for example, is very different from the Palestinian slaughter of families in a stealth raid followed by their retreat to positions behind their own human shield children. The problem with a concept such as jus in bello, the law of war, is that it tends to remain frozen in people's minds as the world around them changes, and further that the inventions of jus in bello were themselves answers to their own particular times, and that they therefore have taken on many different forms in history. And something that has already changed many times in history may need to change again. In light of all this, it becomes easier to understand what an utter disaster multiculturalism has been and will continue to be for Europe. I have shown in my Western self-contempt what really should be obvious enough, namely that multiculturalism, or what we call diversity, in the long run always weakens social cohesion and the power of the state, and encourages neo-tribalism. The historical evidence in this regard is absolutely overwhelming. But even in the present circumstances, there persists a remarkable cluelessness in Western Europe by which many continue to believe that the undesirable elements of other cultures only constitute a minority. But by polling data, this is clearly not the case, and direct empirical observation tends to confirm it as well. And so another thought cliché that we ought to question concerns the supposed silent majority who are against the extremists. In actual fact, however, those who are silent are the minority, and those who are in the majority are not silent, and it would behoove us to listen to what they actually say. And so my earlier remark that power will one day again be the ultimate language in Europe as well, and not just in the Middle East and other more remote corners of the world, was not some flippant line of doom and gloom, but something that is already beginning to be seen. In Western Europe, the homegrown cultures must learn to insist on themselves if they wish to survive in any meaningful sense. It is important to point out, in line with the aforementioned language of power, that such insistence would be less concerned with what is morally right and more concerned with what is needed as a practical matter. It would, by necessity, include such policy options as a total halt to immigration from certain countries, as well as, wherever doable, deportations in cases of crime or overt terrorist support, and financially incentivized voluntary repatriations. Again, some will quibble about the morality of such undertakings, but those people miss the point. One can, of course, make a perfectly coherent moral case for these policy options as well, but as the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus understood as he surveyed Carthage, and as Machiavelli saw as he withdrew into his study in the evening, reality will have its own logic and necessity. Of course, power as the ultimate arbiter of right never really left us. It only remained hidden from most people's view by the fact that the post-war American order was one of relative peace, open trade, and capitalist liberalism. But, like everything else, this could not last forever. As I insisted to people already in the early and mid-2000s while living in various European countries, declining American power would one day lead to a more chaotic world and a return to an ostentatious display of power as the final arbiter of right. I was laughed at by Germans and French alike, who could not stomach the thought that the world order into which our generation had been born was due to America. But this did not disconcert me, because I knew that we would see the veracity of my prediction already within our lifetimes. The Ukraine war that broke out last year was a first step toward Westerners finally realizing this. May the new war be a second step. The mere fact, regrettable indeed, that we have to have a discussion like this one is another indication of how we are approaching the return of the ultimate language of power. So there you have it. Thank you for watching and listening. And if you're interested in the subject, do check out those two articles of mine that I linked to in the description below. And also, if you did enjoy this video, do please consider liking and sharing it with others. I don't usually ask that actually, but I will in this case because I think this topic is particularly important. But in any case, and in spite of it all, I wish you a very happy 2024.